The land was low, flat, and hot, baked by a brutal sun and split by the slow, heavy waters of the Euphrates. Before stone, before empire, there was mud mixed with reeds, pressed into bricks, dry beneath the desert sky. That was the beginning. There was no thunder, no lightning bolt of birth. Just families settling near water, men carving canals with bone tools, women tending barley that clung to the silt. The settlement that would one day be called Babylon did not begin as a capital. It began as survival. Around 2300 BCE, it was just another in a patchwork of city-states, overshadowed by older powers like Uruk, Nippur, and Uar. These were cities with kings and gods, walls and ziggurats, armies and scribes. Babylon, still young, had little to offer but its position. That would prove enough. It lay at a crossroads where north met south, where traders crossed, where armies marched. It did not need to be mighty at first. It only needed to be in the way. The Akkadians came first, under Sargon the Great, sweeping across Sumer and stamping their will on the map. Babylon was absorbed, a minor outpost in a growing empire. It did not resist. It observed. As dynasties rose and fell, it waited, and when the great Akkadian Empire crumbled under pressure from the Gutians and internal collapse, Babylon remained. It had learned early how to outlive. By 1894 BCE, a new power stirred within its walls. A man named Bum declared himself king, not of an empire, but of a city. A century of struggle followed as his Amorite dynasty slowly expanded its influence, fighting for scraps against rival kings. But by the time Hammurabi took the throne in 1792 BC, Babylon was poised for something greater. He did not build Babylon from scratch. He shaped its moment. Hammurabi was ruthless and clever. He played rivals against each other, waited for their strength to drain, then struck. Over 40 years, he transformed Babylon from a city-state into the capital of a realm that stretched from the Persian Gulf to Mari. He built walls, canals, temples, and palaces, but more importantly, he built order. The Code of Hammurabi, etched in stone, wasn't just law, it was legitimacy. Kings had ruled before. He made it sacred. He made it visible. By his death around 1750 BC, Babylon was no longer a border town. It was a center. It held the gods' attention. It spoke with the voice of civilization. From its scribes came contracts and chronicles. From its priests came rituals. From its merchants came goods that had traveled hundreds of miles. It called itself the heart of the world, and the world began to agree. The rise was not meteoric. It was methodical. There was no sudden miracle, just brick upon brick, law upon law, trade upon trade. People came not because Babylon demanded it, but because Babylon made itself essential. It became the link, the middle ground, the promised city. And so it stood, not in defiance of its muddy origins, but because of them, because it knew the fragility of greatness, because it remembered when it had been nothing. That memory would feed its pride, and in time, its vulnerability. But for now, in the age of Hammurabi, Babylon believed it had touched eternity. It looked to the sky with towers of stone, never doubting that its foundations were strong. The walls of Babylon did more than defend. They boasted. They whispered power in every stone, every gate, every terrace overlooking the Euphrates. In the centuries after Hammurabi, Babylon grew from a capital into an idea, a dream in mud brick and gold. The ziggurat of Etemenanke, towering in the city's heart, was said to link heaven and earth. The city's temple to Marduk, Esagila, became the center of Mesopotamian ritual, law, and legitimacy. Even when Babylon's political grip weakened, its spiritual weight never did. Kings needed the city more than it needed them. Rulers came to be crowned in Babylon because no crown felt complete without Marduk's approval. Processions wound through sacred streets during the Akita festival, when the king had to kneel and beg the god's favor. Without it, his reign was considered cursed. And so Babylon became not just powerful, but necessary. To rule Mesopotamia, one had to first bow in Babylon. But the city's glory became a mirror, and every ambitious king saw himself reflected in it. Babylon's wealth, drawn from trade, tribute, and conquest, passed through its markets in quantities unheard of elsewhere. Caravans carried lapis from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, copper from Oman. Its scribes recorded contracts with meticulous care. Its libraries grew. Its schools trained priests and administrators for the entire region. Even the spoken dialect of Babylon, Old Babylonian, became the language of diplomacy for centuries. Its reputation soared far beyond its own borders. Traders from Anatolia and Elam, envoys from Egypt and Levant, all made their way to its gates. They brought stories home of a city that sparkled at dusk, of temples that rose like mountains, of scribes who could summon the past with stylus and clay. Babylon became the standard. To build like Babylon, to rule like Babylon, to be remembered like Babylon. This became a measure of greatness. But admiration bred ambition. And ambition, envy. The Hittites saw Babylon as a rival too close to the edge of their reach. In 1595 BCE, King Mursilai marched deep into Mesopotamia, bypassing other cities to strike at the heart. Babylon, exhausted by infighting and weak successors after the fall of Hammurabi's line, could not resist. The Hittites sacked the city and left. They did not stay. They didn't need to. Their goal had been to break the myth, to show that Babylon could bleed. In their wake came the Kassites, mountain people from the Zagros who had watched from a distance. They did not invade with force. They entered a city already stunned, then settled into its broken throne. For over 4 centuries, they ruled Babylon, not as conquerors, but as stewards. They rebuilt, they respected the old gods, they upheld the rituals. Babylon remained, but now as host outsiders. Its name endured, its streets still bustled, its temples still drew pilgrims, but the soul of independence had shifted. Still, the Kassites took Babylon's image and wore it like armor. They issued decrees in its language. They rebuilt shrines in its style. They ruled through imitation, not transformation. Yet the city never again felt purely its own. And beyond its walls, other powers stirred. To the north, the Assyrians grew restless, building an empire of steel and fire. To the south, Elamite kings waited for weakness. Every generation saw a new threat peering toward the walls. Every king who visited sought legitimacy, but some came with other intentions. Some came to own it, some to burn it. Babylon's light, visible for miles across the plains, was not just a beacon. It was a target. Its wealth invited looting. Its status provoked challenge. Its tradition, so rigid and sacred, became reasons to dominate. If Babylon was the heart, then cutting it meant power. Even within, nobles plotted, priests argued, and factions vied for influence. The crown of Babylon gave status, but rarely peace. No throne in the ancient world was more desired, or more dangerous. Each generation of kings felt the same pull: bend the city to their will, claim its name, and outshine those who came before. But each failed to grasp the weight of Babylon's past. They wanted the crown, but not the burden. And Babylon watched them all. The city did not fall. It endured, but the strain showed. Between glory and envy, between worship and war, it stood. Exalted, exhausted, envied by all who gazed upon it. The blade is not always what cuts deepest. Babylon, across its long shadow of time, learned that enemies could wear crowns, chant prayers, and pass through gates unchallenged. The city had known siege and conquest, but its most lasting damage came not from invasion, but from within. After the Kassite dynasty lost its grip around 1155 BCE, the city fractured once more. Power passed like a flickering flame between rival dynasties, some Babylonian, some foreign, none stable. The throne became a game of short reigns, sudden overthrows, and uneasy alliances. The ritual authority of the city remained intact. The Akita festival still crowned kings. Marduk was still honored. But behind the ceremony, the ground shifted. Priestly factions within the great temples clashed over interpretation, over inheritance, over purity of ritual. Some accused others of corrupting the rites for political favor. Others refused to recognize new kings. When religious legitimacy wavered, so did the people's faith in the system. Some turned to local cults, others to rival deities. The unity of Babylon, long held together by belief, began to fray. Famine followed, worsened by irregular flooding of the Euphrates. Fields once lush with barley dried into dust or drowned in misplaced canals. Irrigation networks, neglected by short-sighted kings and feuding governors, collapsed in stretches. Crop yields fell. Prices rose. Grain became a weapon. The poor gathered at temple doors in hunger, while nobles hoarded wealth. With famine came unrest. With unrest came blood. Assyria, growing stronger to the north, did not need to attack. Babylon's weakness invited manipulation. Assyrian kings installed puppet rulers, deposed them when they disobeyed, and offered military aid only when it suited their strategy. One Assyrian king would back a Babylonian noble's claim to the throne. Another would betray him. Babylon, still proud, still holy, was being used. The Elamites, longtime rivals from the east, also saw an opening. In 1125 BCE, they marched into the city and looted its treasures, including the statue of Marduk himself. That theft was more than symbolic. Without the god's image, the rituals of kingship could not be completed. Babylon's identity was literally stolen. The Elamites didn't destroy the city, they humiliated it. No blade can wound like shame. In the absence of strong leadership, provinces broke away. Local warlords rose, ruled for a year or two, and vanished. The great walls of Babylon still stood. Its gates still opened and closed each day. But the sense of destiny, the belief in permanence, that began to flicker when the Chaldeans, a tribal people from the south, began to migrate into Babylonian territory. They were dismissed at first as nomads, but they settled, traded, married, and waited. In time, they began to claim cities, not with war, but with presence. They took titles. They funded temples. And slowly, Babylon became theirs, not by conquest, but by default. Each ruler who claimed Babylon sought to use its prestige. But each time they did, they also chipped away at its autonomy. Kings ruled from elsewhere. Armies passed through. Policies were written far from the city's courtyards. Babylon remained central in name, but peripheral in fact. Internally, trust withered. The Council of Elders, once a respected body, became a tool for whichever faction held the palace. Temple scribes recorded omens less frequently. The great libraries, once filled with fresh tablets each season, began to copy old texts instead of producing new ones. The past became safer than the present. Babylon was not destroyed. It was diluted. Every new ruler who used its name without understanding its weight weakened it. Every decree made in its name by foreign kings drained its meaning. The gods still had temples, but their voices went unheard. The walls stood, but the purpose behind them faded. By the 8th century BCE, Assyria finally formalized what had already become true. Babylon would not lead. It would follow. Kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II claimed both crowns, Assyrian and Babylonian, but ruled from Nineveh or Kalhu. They gave Babylon titles, rebuilt its monuments, performed the rituals. But the independence was gone. Babylon had become a symbol. Powerful, yes, but hollowed. The city's pride endured. Uprisings broke out. Rebellions flared. People still believed in what Babylon had been. But each rebellion ended the same way. Suppression, looting, another puppet king. Each time, Babylon's name survived, but its soul thinned. It wasn't a siege that did this. It wasn't fire. It was drought and decay. It was politics and pride. It was a slow erosion of power handed over, piece by piece, until all that remained was memory. Babylon was no longer the conqueror. It had become the prize. And those who sought to own it, in the process, hollowed it from within. The Assyrians came like a hammer striking glass. They did not simply invade. They redefined what it meant to dominate. Where earlier empires sought legitimacy through Babylon, Assyria sought obedience. And when they didn't get it, they shattered what stood in their way. Babylon, ancient and proud, refused to kneel. That refusal turned defiance into fire. At first, Babylon tried diplomacy. Assyrian kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II were courted with gifts, rituals, and titles. Babylon remained a ceremonial jewel in their crowns, but always restless. The city's elite resented their diminished power. The priests saw the Assyrian kings as outsiders who performed the rites but lacked the divine favor. The people whispered that the gods would not tolerate foreign rule forever. That belief fueled revolt. Again and again, Babylon rose in rebellion, sometimes under native leaders, sometimes under Assyrian-appointed kings who turned against their masters. Each time, the city gambled everything, and each time, the Assyrian response grew harsher. Then came Sennacherib. He did not want Babylon's blessing. He wanted its silence. After a particularly brutal revolt in 689 BC, led by his own son who had defected to the Babylonian side, Sennacherib lost all patience. His campaign was not aimed at conquest. It was retribution. He ordered the temples leveled. The ziggurat of Etemenenki, once said to reach the heavens, was torn apart brick by brick. The sacred statue of Marduk was taken. The canals that fed the city were sabotaged. Fields were flooded with salt water. The city's population was slaughtered or deported. Babylon was not just defeated. It was erased. Sennacherib documented his victory with cold pride. He claimed he had turned the city into a lake. In a world where rulers often sought divine approval, he defied the gods and dared them to punish him, and perhaps they did. Within years, he was assassinated, cut down in his own temple by two of his other sons. His death was seen by many as divine justice. The destruction of Babylon had gone too far. His successor, Esarhaddon, took a different path. Guilt or fear, perhaps both, moved him to rebuild. He ordered the temples reconstructed, the statue of Marduk returned, and the rituals restored. He sought to undo the damage, not just in brick, but in belief. The process took years. Esarhaddon even named his son Shamash-shum-ukin as king of Babylon, while keeping his elder son Ashurbanipal on the throne in Nineveh. It was meant to be a compromise. It became a tragedy. The two brothers ruled in tense parallel. Ashurbanipal, the scholar warrior, saw himself as guardian of empire. Shamash-shum-ukin, steeped in Babylonian tradition, saw himself as the rightful heir to ancient kingship. Their peace was brittle. It cracked in 652 BC. The civil war that followed was catastrophic. Babylon once again became a battlefield, not just of armies, but of ideologies. Ashurbanipal besieged the city, starved it, broke it. When he took it, he unleashed fury. The archives were looted, the libraries gutted. Whatever Esarhaddon had rebuilt was torn down once more. And yet, Babylon did not vanish. The fires did not consume its name. The temples, desecrated, were still rebuilt. The rituals resumed. Its people, deported, returned. The city, twice burned in a generation, kept rising from its own ash. No magic fueled this. It was the weight of memory. Babylon was too deeply rooted to die easily. Even its conquerors, after destroying it, felt compelled to resurrect it. Babylon mattered, not just to its inhabitants, but to the very idea of kingship in the Near East. Without Babylon, no empire could truly claim legitimacy. Assyrian rulers continued to inscribe titles like King of Babylon alongside King of the Universe, even when the city smoldered behind them. They needed its name more than they needed its consent. But each cycle of rebellion and retribution drained it. The people of Babylon learned that resistance brought ruin. Some still resisted, others despaired. The gods were still honored, the festivals still kept, but now under watchful eyes. Soldiers stood in temple courtyards. Spies moved among the priests. Babylon's power was no longer in its sword or scepter, but in its symbolism, and that made it dangerous. By the end of the Assyrian century, Babylon was not thriving. It was enduring. It had been humiliated, depopulated, flooded, burned, and rebuilt, but it still stood. Its walls, though damaged, still marked the sacred perimeter. Its ziggurats, though scarred, still touched the sky. The name still echoed, but it no longer ruled. And in the north, in a mountain-walled city called Nineveh, the Assyrians believed they had finally tamed the ancient giant. They had not destroyed Babylon. They had used it, but in that use, they had made enemies. And among those enemies in the southern marshes, a new power stirred, the Chaldeans. They watched, they remembered, And they would soon remind the world that Babylon, though bruised, could still rise not just from ash, but as vengeance. The ruins had barely cooled before new hands began lifting stones again. This time, they came not from Assyria, but from the deep southern marshes, where the Tigris and Euphrates blurred into wetlands, and where ancient cities like Ur still whisper of gods and kings. The Chaldeans were not newcomers. They had been lingering in Babylonian land for generations, marrying into local families, pledging allegiance when useful, rebelling when forgotten. By the late 7th century BCE, they saw a new path, not through negotiation but domination. Nabopolassar, a Chaldean tribal leader with political cunning and military skill, made his move in 626 BCE. He declared himself king of Babylon, capitalized on Assyria's internal chaos, and forged an alliance with the Medes, those wild horsemen from the Iranian plateau who had long waited for a chance to crush Nineveh. The Assyrian Empire, overstretched and hated, began to buckle. And in 612 BCE, the unthinkable happened. Nineveh fell. The capital of the great Assyrian terror was sacked. Its libraries burned. Its king slain. The world's power balance shifted. Babylon was back. Nabopolassar ruled long enough to see his enemies fall. But it was his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, who would redefine Babylon, not just for his time, but for history. His reign, from 605 to 562 BC, was not merely long. It was transformative. In his hands, the city became something more than a capital. It became myth. Nebuchadnezzar poured the wealth of conquest into brick and stone. The city's walls were rebuilt, not as mere defense, but as monument. Their thickness astonished even seasoned generals. Herodotus would later claim a chariot could turn on top of them. The Ishtar Gate, adorned with brilliant blue tiles and roaring lions, became a symbol of divine protection and royal might. Processional ways stretched in straight, disciplined lines, each brick stamped with the king's name, as if to bind every piece of the city to his will. Temples were not just restored, they were reborn. The great ziggurat of Etemenanke rose again. Climbing higher than before, its summit meant to kiss the heavens. Esagila, Marduk's sanctuary, gleamed with gold and cedar. Nebuchadnezzar spared no expense to present Babylon as the axis of the world, where gods and men met. He was no mere builder. He was a conqueror. His campaigns reached deep into Syria and Palestine. He defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish, humbled the kingdoms of Judah, Tyre, and Ammon, and brought thousands of captives back to Babylon. Among them were scribes, priests, artisans, and kings, men who would later write their exile and weep by foreign rivers, always naming Babylon as the place of both splendor and sorrow. It was during this time, perhaps, that the Hanging Gardens were constructed. Though debated by scholars and poorly recorded, they linger in legend as a marvel of engineering. Terraced gardens lifted above the city, irrigated by secret mechanisms. Whether Nebuchadnezzar built them for a homesick Median wife or to flaunt his genius, they entered the world's memory as one of its wonders. Real or not, they represented Babylon's new ambition. To awe, the city pulsed with life. Merchants packed its markets with goods from the Indus, the Nile, and the Aegean. Priests conducted rituals to harmonize heaven and earth. Scholars studied omens, tracked planets, and wrote tablets that would survive 2,000 years. Babylon was no longer just a city. It was a lens through which the ancient world saw order, power, and permanence. But glory as gravity. The more Nebuchadnezzar built, the more the world watched. Babylon's beauty was not a shield. It was a beacon. Behind the grandeur, problems festered. The conquest brought wealth, but also enemies. The captives who built palaces remembered their lost homes. The noble families, enriched by war, began to compete for influence. The priesthood, restored in power, resumed its old divisions. And Nebuchadnezzar, growing older, became increasingly obsessed with maintaining control. He tightened his grip. His inscriptions shifted in tone, from triumphant to desperate, from celebrating gods to declaring his own might. When he died, the machine he had built began to wobble. His successors were weak. His son Marduk ruled for only 2 years before being murdered by a relative. The next, Neriglissar, a general and usurper, tried to hold the center, but died within 4 years. His son, still a child, was removed in a coup. And then came Nabonidus, a strange king, a scholar more than a soldier, obsessed with moon gods over Marduk, and absent from Babylon for 10 years while he lived in Arabia. His rule angered priests, confused generals, and unsettled the people. By the time Cyrus of Persia began his campaigns, Babylon was vulnerable again, not because its walls had weakened, but because its unity had. Nebuchadnezzar had built a city of wonder, but in doing so, he made it the greatest prize of the ancient world. Every rival now saw it not just as a city, but as a throne worth taking. The city had touched the peak of its legend. It gleamed, it thundered with the prayers of priests, it dazzled even those who hated it. But already, the winds were changing. The Euphrates still flowed beside its gates, but farther upstream, it would soon be diverted. Not with rage, not with fire, but with calculation. Babylon had become too great to ignore, and that, more than anything, would ensure that it would not be allowed to stand unchallenged. The city that had once resisted flame, famine, and fury was not taken by siege engines or starving crowds. Babylon, whose walls had turned back armies for centuries, fell without a single catapult stone hurled in anger. It was not a war that broke the city. It was timing and disillusionment and the quiet strategy of a man who understood the cracks beneath the gold. Cyrus the Great had already carved out an empire that stretched from the mountains of Persia to the shores of Anatolia. He was not a barbarian at the gates. He was a ruler with an eye for symbols. He knew what Babylon represented. It was not just another city to add to his map. It was the city of laws, temples, and myth, the city that had once crowned Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar. If he could take it, without destroying it, the world would know his rule was destined. In 539 BCE, Cyrus prepared to do exactly that. Babylon was strong in stone, but brittle in spirit. Nabonidus, the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, had alienated the priests of Marduk, the very men who controlled the city's legitimacy. His obsession with Sin, the moon god, had drawn worship away from Babylon's divine core. For a decade, he had been absent from the capital, living in self-imposed exile in Tama, an oasis town in the Arabian desert. His return to Babylon had been marked not by triumph but by confusion. The old rituals were disrupted. The Akita festival was not properly observed. To the priests and the people, it was as if the city's heart had skipped a beat. Cyrus saw opportunity where others saw ritual failure. Instead of approaching as an enemy, he positioned himself as a restorer. His agents spread word ahead of him that he came not to sack Babylon but to save it. He would honor Marduk. He would restore the temples. He would be what Nabonidus was not: present, respectful, stable. This was not a military campaign. It was a political seduction. Cyrus's army, under the command of Gobrias, reached the walls of Babylon in October of 539 BCE, but they did not attempt a direct assault. Instead, they diverted the Euphrates River upstream. Babylon's defenses relied on the river as both moat and water source, an eternal presence that made the city feel unconquerable. But rivers can be turned. The level of the Euphrates dropped, and under the cover of night, Persian soldiers walked the exposed riverbed beneath Babylon's massive walls, through the river gates that had never been meant to be defended. Inside the city, the gates opened, not because of fear, but because of exhaustion. The people did not rise to defend their king. The army did not take up arms. The priests did not call upon the gods to smite the invaders. When Gobrias entered Babylon, he found no organized resistance. Nabonidus had returned too late to matter. His palace was taken without a fight. Babylon did not fall. It surrendered, not in panic, but in quiet, collective resignation. 2 weeks later, Cyrus entered the city himself. No fires, no massacres. He paid homage at the temple of Marduk. He allowed local officials to remain in power. He released displaced peoples, including the Judeans, allowing them to return home and rebuild their temples. To many, he appeared as a liberator, not only in words but in action. He issued the Cyrus Cylinder, a declaration etched into clay, proclaiming that he had been chosen by Marduk himself to restore order and justice. The text was political genius. It claimed divine approval, but in the voice of Babylonian tradition. He wasn't erasing the city's legacy. He was absorbing it, Babylon continued to operate as a major city. The temples resumed their functions. The scribes kept writing. Trade flourished. But the core had shifted. For the first time, Babylon was no longer the seat of empire. It was an imperial possession. Its kingship was gone. Its autonomy lost. Cyrus didn't dismantle Babylon. He preserved it as a museum of its own greatness. But preservation is not power. The city, though physically intact, no longer decided its own future. The decisions were made in Persepolis and Susa. Babylon's glory was now a borrowed robe worn by foreign kings. The Persians learned to walk its sacred paths, to perform its rituals, to write in cuneiform. But they did so as outsiders, respectful but not rooted. The city remained full, but not full of purpose. Its gods were honored, but not feared. Its archives were maintained, but not expanded. Even the daily life of the Babylonians began to shift. The language changed slowly, from Akkadian to Aramaic. The markets grew quieter. The great schools of astronomy continued, but their discoveries now served another empire. Babylon remained rich, but it no longer dictated wealth. It remained holy, but its holiness had been franchised. The fall of Babylon, then, was not a moment. It was a handover, a soft collapse, a surrender not of walls, but of will. The city still looked like Babylon, but it no longer acted like Babylon. It no longer dreamed of empire. It no longer spoke with the voice of kings. It had passed into history without burning, without breaking. But in doing so, it had lost what made it feared, what had made it necessary. It stood as a monument to its past, alive, yet no longer sovereign. The river still ran, the walls still stood, but the heart had been replaced. And all of it had happened quietly, under a night sky, as water shifted course and the gates swung open. Alexander the Great entered Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a prodigal son returning to a house of gods he had never met, yet deeply respected. In 331 BCE, after defeating Darius III of Persia at Gaugamela, Alexander marched triumphantly into the ancient city. There was no resistance. The gates opened willingly. The people lined the streets. Priests greeted him with incense and ritual. To them, he was not a foreigner. He was the latest in a long line of rulers who understood that to hold Babylon was to hold the key to legitimacy. Alexander understood symbolism as deeply as he understood warfare. He did not plunder Babylon. He did not reduce it to ash. He ordered it restored. He paid tribute to Marduk, honored Babylonian gods in their own temples, and wore local dress to prove he belonged, not just in the moment but in history. He consulted Chaldean astronomers, listened to oracles, and made offerings where his Persian predecessors had only posed. His respect for the city's rituals was real, or at least politically real. He declared that Babylon would become the capital of his empire, a hub for the world he had conquered. From Macedon to India, he planned administrative centers, military headquarters, cultural crossroads. Babylon was not to be a relic. It was to be reborn at the center of a unified world. He saw its location, between east and west, between deserts and rivers, as ideal. The walls would rise again. The canals would be cleared. The city would host not just soldiers, but scholars, artisans, and scribes. But dreams don't build cities. Time does, and Alexander ran out of it. In 323 BCE, just 8 years after entering Babylon, Alexander fell ill in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. Fever consumed him, whether by poison, disease, or exhaustion. He died in the very city he had chosen to elevate. His body remained in Babylon for weeks while his generals argued. His dream of a world capital, half Greek and half Babylonian, died with him, and with it, Babylon's chance at revival. His successors, the Diadochi, fought bitterly for control of his vast but fractured empire. Babylon once again became a pawn. At first it went to Seleucus, who valued its legacy but not its logistics. The Seleucid kings chose to build a new city nearby, Seleucia on the Tigris. Positioned to favor Greek administrative models and military planning, Seleucia began to drain Babylon's life. Merchants moved their goods to the newer city. Bureaucrats relocated. Priests stayed at first, clinging to their rituals, but their influence waned. Temples still held festivals, but attendance fell. Donations dried up. Babylon was being eclipsed not violently, but deliberately, systematically. The Greeks brought their language, their coins, their statues. They respected Babylon's past, even studied it, but they did not live by it. Babylon's gods were not their gods. Its rituals were foreign, its temples awkward. They translated cuneiform texts not to preserve the spirit, but to extract knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, medicine. Babylon's culture was mined like a resource, not adopted. The library still had scribes, but their clay tablets began to pile up in unused corners. The great observatories noted eclipses, but fewer students came to learn. The city's voice, once a roar heard across continents, fell to a whisper. The ziggurat of Etemenanke, once the stairway between heaven and earth, crumbled, not by war but by weather, time, and neglect. Under Seleucid rule, Babylon became peripheral. Greek-style cities flourished. Greek dialects dominated. Even Aramaic, the regional tongue, began to replace Akkadian in markets and courts. The Babylonian calendar still ticked forward, but its context was fading. Fewer officials could read the old script. Even fewer cared to try. By the 2nd century BCE, the temple struggled to maintain staff. Priests died without replacement. Entire pantheons were worshipped in silence. Clay bricks were repurposed for new buildings in other cities. Statues disappeared, either looted or left to rot. The canals, once meticulously maintained, began to silt up. Fields flooded or dried. Farming declined. Villages moved. The land itself began to forget. The city that had been the axis of the ancient world was now bypassed by the road. By the time the Parthians took the region in the late 2nd century BCE, Babylon was little more than a memory they could walk through. Their rule was decentralized and indifferent. Babylon remained a ceremonial stop for a few nobles, an occasional place of mention in scrolls, but never again a capital. It was not destroyed. It was ignored. Visitors still came, some from Rome, some from Persia. They found broken gates, partially standing temples, and the echoes of a city that once judged kings. They walked where Alexander had died, where Nebuchadnezzar had prayed, where Hammurabi had ruled, but they heard no answers from the stones. A final generation of priests continued the rituals, fewer each year. The last dated cuneiform tablet from Babylon comes from the 1st century CE. After that, silence. No more names. No more stars tracked. No more kings crowned beneath Ishtar's lions. The Greeks had taken Babylon's name, worn it as a laurel of cultural victory, and moved on. They studied its science, respected its lore, but they did not love it, not as a home, not as a living force. They turned the city into a lesson, a museum, and in doing so, they drained it. Babylon did not fall to Alexander. It fell after him, slowly, gently, irrevocably, not by fire, not by flood, but by forgetting. The temple stood quiet before the houses, emptied. It was not the people who first abandoned Babylon. It was the gods. Not all at once, not in dramatic exodus, but in the slow erosion of presence. Marduk, lord of the city, no longer received offerings with the same regularity. His priests dwindled in number. His processions, once grand parades of divine spectacle, ceased to march through the streets. The sacred rites faded, not because they were outlawed, but because the men who knew them grew old, died, and left no successors. The great ziggurat, Etemenanke, once towering as a mountain of human devotion, began to collapse. Its outer bricks fell with each season. Rain carved through its steps. No masons came to repair it. Without the will to maintain it, its divine stairway became a hill of debris. The people no longer looked to its summit for divine favor. They passed by it, silent, eyes downcast. The divine had become background, a shadow, not a guide. Babylon was not seized by a new religion in a single blow. Zoroastrianism, under the Achaemenid Persians, did not demand destruction of Babylonian worship, but offered a new cosmology, one in which fire temples replaced ziggurats, and in which Ahura Mazda, the singular god, took precedence over the complex, crowded pantheon of Mesopotamian deities. For many, the shift was not enforced. It was simply easier, cleaner, simpler. The crowded heavens of Babylon, Anu, Enlil, Ishtar, Nergal, became irrelevant to new rulers and new generations. As Hellenistic culture spread, Greek gods were layered on top of local beliefs. Marduk was likened to Zeus, Ishtar to Aphrodite. But these were analogies, not adoptions. The temples might have kept their names, but the hearts of the worshippers shifted. They no longer prayed in Akkadian. They offered less. They asked less. Babylonian religion, once the axis of political power and civic life, was now ornamental, ceremonial, outdated. By the 1st century BCE, Christianity emerged in the Near East, not yet dominant, but growing, whispering of a single God and a salvation not dependent on stars or sacrifices. In time, those whispers turned to sermons, then congregations. Babylon, which had once dictated cosmic order through its priests and calendars, found itself outside the conversation. The temples fell further into disuse. Roofs caved in. Sacred courtyards became grazing ground for animals. Bricks were scavenged by nearby villagers, repurposed into homes and walls elsewhere. What once had been god houses became quarries. And yet, people remained. A scattering of families, artisans, traders. They lived among the ruins, not in reverence but out of habit. Babylon's fertile locations still allowed for subsistence farming. The canals, though partially silted, could still be coaxed into usefulness. Its bones were too solid to vanish overnight. The name still had weight, but its meaning had shifted. It no longer stood for empire or divinity. It meant home, barely. Travelers still passed through, noting the remnants of glory. Greek and Roman writers recorded their impressions. Columns fallen, temples ruined, gates still bearing the names of long-dead kings. But they described it as a curiosity, not a force. Babylon had become the past and the present. A ghost city, still alive in form, but dead in spirit. Under Parthian rule, there was no revival. The empire, decentralized and more concerned with its own centers of power, let Babylon drift. Under the Sasanians, Zoroastrianism solidified its dominance. The last Babylonian temples were closed, not burned, not smashed, but ignored until the ceilings fell in and the floors filled with dirt. The priests, if any remained, either converted, migrated, or faded into poverty and silence. When Islam rose in the 7th century CE, Babylon barely registered as a living place. Arab chroniclers referred to it as a ruin. The Quran mentioned Babylon briefly, not as a city of glory, but as a place where fallen angels taught forbidden knowledge. A warning, not a beacon. The great towers and walls were no longer sites of pilgrimage, but of speculation. Dust covered the inscriptions. Languages changed. Scripts were forgotten. Still, the bricks remained. Villagers continued to strip them, using the perfectly baked clay to build homes and ovens. Each removed brick was a forgotten word, a lost name, a broken sentence in a language no longer spoken. Babylon was unbuilt not in destruction, but in repurposing. Its past was dismantled to shelter other lives, other futures. No final priest rang a last bell. No final citizen closed the gate. Babylon didn't die with ceremony. It died in habit, in footsteps fading, in rituals skipped for more practical needs. It died in silence, then was buried by the winds. By the time Islamic scholars began collecting ancient knowledge, Babylon had already become legend. Its gods were myths. Its ziggurats were hills. Its meaning was no longer urban or religious. It had become a warning. The arrogant city that defied heaven, the tower that tried to reach the skies. The name was remembered, but the place was left behind. The gods left quietly. The people followed. And what remained was a memory etched into stone, slowly scraped away by centuries that no longer needed it. Babylon's bones were still warm when the Romans arrived, not with legions to conquer, but with curiosity. By then, the city was not a rival, not a threat, not even a proper settlement. It was a story, half remembered, half buried beneath the sands of time. Roman travelers passed through. Scribes recorded what they saw: stretches of wall, half-standing columns, and temple foundations that led nowhere. There were no kings, no priests, only shepherd merchants and ghosts. but the name remained powerful. Babylon, to the Romans, meant ancient wisdom, decadence, danger, and warning. Latin authors, Tacitus, Pliny, Strabo, wrote of its history, not its present. They repeated older Greek accounts, speculated on the Hanging Gardens, mocked the tower, debated the city's fall. No Roman emperor ruled from Babylon, but every educated Roman knew its legend. It became shorthand for fallen greatness, for Eastern mystery, for a civilization too proud to last. The Persians under the Sasanian dynasty paid even less attention. Their eyes were on Ctesiphon, the imperial capital to the north. Babylon was a leftover, a place known to exist, but irrelevant to modern politics. Its canals dried further. The Euphrates, changing course, left sections of the ruins landlocked. Soil overtook foundations. The temples that had stood for over a millennium were indistinguishable from hills. When Arab armies swept across Mesopotamia in the 7th century CE, they found little of Babylon that could be claimed as strategic. They established new cities, Kufa, Basra, Baghdad. They did not rebuild Babylon. They did not need to. Its power was spent, its people dispersed. But its name did not disappear. It shifted from geography to scripture. In Jewish memory, Babylon never vanished. It remained a place of exile. The city where the temple treasures of Jerusalem had once been paraded through foreign streets, where psalms were written in sorrow. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept, not a geographic location anymore, but a symbol of displacement, of foreign dominance, of loss. In Christian tradition, Babylon was transformed from empire to allegory. The book of Revelation turned it into the mother of harlots, a cipher for Rome, sin, and corruption. Babylon was no longer a city of bricks and mortar. It was a spiritual enemy, the archetype of evil civilization. The real city had faded into dust, but its reputation grew darker, more abstract, more powerful. It became eternal, but not as its builders intended. Islamic scholars in the golden age of Abbasid science approached Babylon differently. They didn't fear it. They studied it. Arabic texts preserve fragments of Babylonian astronomical knowledge. Astrolabes were designed with techniques descended from Babylon star watchers. But the site itself? It was a ruin, occasionally mentioned, seldom visited. It had no more ritual to offer. Its gods were long dead. The wisdom extracted from it now belonged to books, not priests. Europe rediscovered Babylon in fragments. Travelers in the Renaissance reported strange ruins in Iraq, speculated wildly about their origins. Some claimed to find a Tower of Babel itself. Others called it the remains of Nimrod's city. Accuracy didn't matter. The myth of Babylon, wicked, magnificent, punished, was already cemented in the European imagination. By the 19th century, European powers began carving up the Middle East with academic maps and colonial greed. The British and Germans sent archaeologists, engineers, and soldiers. They dug into the ground and found tablets, walls, statues. The ancient cuneiform script was deciphered. Names that had vanished for 2,000 years were spoken again. Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar, Sennacherib. Babylon rose from the dust, not as a city, but as an excavation. Museums in London and Berlin filled with its artifacts. The Ishtar Gate, painstakingly reconstructed with glazed bricks, stood not in Iraq, but in Germany. Babylon's treasures were now property of foreign empires. Its image, its legacy, its symbols, claimed and displayed by powers that had never known its roads, never heard its rituals, never touched its altars in reverence. No one rebuilt Babylon. They studied it. They mined its history. They took pieces of its glory, but they did not restore it. The land around it remained sparsely inhabited. Some attempted resettlement. Others used the bricks for villages, but no king returned. No temple was rededicated. The city's essence, its purpose, was gone. In modern times, Babylon became a site for national pride and propaganda. Saddam Hussein, seeking to connect his regime to Mesopotamian grandeur, ordered sections of Babylon to be rebuilt. New bricks, stamped with his own name, were laid atop ancient foundations. But they were not built with faith. They were not meant to honor Marduk or appease gods. They were hollow gestures, political theater posing as revival. Tourists came, and then war came again. During the 2003 Iraq War, Babylon suffered further indignity. American forces built a military base on the site, damaging fragile ruins with tanks, helicopters, and heavy equipment. Layers of ancient soil were crushed. The city that once ruled the world was now occupied by a foreign army that knew its name, but not its story. And yet, the name persists. Babylon is invoked in speeches, songs, sermons. It is still a symbol of grandeur, of sin, of wisdom, of warning. Empires that never touched it still speak its name. But the actual city, the ground itself, remains quiet. Its gods are not prayed to. Its rituals are not remembered. Its bricks are worn smooth by wind. Babylon gave the world law, myth, and memory. And in return, the world took its ashes, scattered them, and claimed them as trophies. There was no single moment, no final trumpet, no lone assassin that brought Babylon down. It was not struck by a god's wrath or swallowed by the earth. It was not consumed in one last inferno. Babylon, the city that once held kings in awe and made gods feel at home, did not collapse. It was dismantled, pulled apart grain by grain, by the very forces that once lifted it up. It was pushed by the ambition of kings who sought to use its name, but ignored its burden. Hammurabi forged a legacy of justice and order, but his successors treated the throne as an inheritance, not a responsibility. They left cracks where outsiders slipped in. The Kassites didn't need an army. They needed only time and neglect. The Assyrians, more brutal, carved into Babylon with steel and fire. Sennacherib burned it not because he feared it, but because it defied him. That pride, on both sides, left scars deeper than the ashes. It was pushed by the envy of empires. Every neighbor wanted it, not to destroy, but to possess. The Hittites sacked it and vanished. The Elamites stole its gods. The Persians seduced it. The Greeks romanticized it. The Romans ignored it. Each took something, its gold, its wisdom, its meaning. Each left it poorer in soul, richer only in reputation. It was pushed by its own belief in eternity. Babylon believed it was unbreakable, and that belief made it slow to change. Its religion, once a living force, hardened into ceremony. Its temples became habit. Its scribes wrote by tradition, not inquiry. When new powers rose with new gods, new languages, new ideas, Babylon stood still. While others adapted, it clung to memory. It did not evolve, it repeated. It was pushed by the hands of its own people, reshaping its bricks into other homes, abandoning its altars for better fields, choosing newer cities with cleaner canals and safer roads. They did not betray Babylon. They outgrew it. When empires collapsed around them, they moved on. The city remained, but it was no longer needed. It was pushed by time itself. Every flood, every drought, every silted canal, every shifting river route played its part. The city's life had always depended on balance, of water, of trade, of ritual. When one part failed, the rest began to lean. By the time Cyrus walked through the riverbed, Babylon's walls still stood, but its spirit had already bent. It was pushed by generations of rulers who saw in it only a crown to wear, not a duty to uphold. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt his monuments, but left no strong heirs. His sons fought over the throne. His empire, so carefully sculpted in brick and glory, unraveled in decades. And then came Nabonidus, a king more interested in distant shrines and moon gods in the heart of his realm. Babylon wasn't crushed under his rule. It drifted. It was pushed by new religions that did not need its stars, its omens, or its gods. Zoroastrian fire burned with a different light. Christianity and Islam told of a different order, one where Babylon was a warning, not a guide. Each faith carried the city's name forward, but never with affection. Babylon became a symbol of what should be avoided, not what should be reclaimed. It was pushed by historians who misunderstood it, and by armies who trampled it, by archaeologists who uncovered it and carted it away, by politicians who wrapped themselves in its past without understanding its meaning. Every attempt to revive Babylon, whether in bricks or in myth, has echoed the same failure, to possess what was never meant to be owned. In the end, Babylon's greatest strength was also its weakness. Everyone wanted it. Everyone thought they could inherit its power. But power doesn't transfer with names. It has to be earned, renewed, honored. Babylon was hallowed not by enemies alone, but by admirers who drained it with every touch. What remains is dust and memory, and a few towering walls that still cast a long shadow. Tourists walked the site. Scholars read its tablets. Its stories live in scripture, in myth, in fragments of clay beneath museum glass. But the city, the living, breathing Babylon, died long ago, not in flames, not in conquest, but in the slow collapse of meaning. It didn't fall from the sky. It was pushed from within and without, over centuries, over generations, until there was nothing left to push. And that is how the City of Kings became the City of Echoes,